A millionaire allowed a homeless old woman and her daughter to live in his basement. But one day, when he entered without knocking, he couldn't believe what they were doing. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any story. Here we go. The sun was setting over New York City, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reflected off the enormous windows of Jack Morgan's penthouse. At 30 years old, Jack was the owner of a business empire that spanned from technology to real estate, a fortune he had inherited after the tragic death of his parents in a plane crash. A decade earlier, Jack observed the city from his privileged position, with a glass of whiskey in hand and his gaze lost on the horizon. Despite having everything money could buy, he felt an emptiness inside that nothing seemed to fill. The extravagant parties, trips around the world, beautiful women throwing themselves at his feet, none of it managed to dispel the feeling of loneliness that overwhelmed him. "Mr. Morgan," interrupted the voice of his butler, Alfred, pulling him from his thoughts. "Dinner is served." Jack nodded without turning, taking a last sip of his drink before heading to the dining room. The huge mahogany table, capable of seating 20 people, awaited him with a single plate at one end. The echo of his footsteps resonated in the silence of the mansion as he took his seat. "Would you like me to accompany you during dinner, sir?" asked Alfred, who had been more than just an employee since his parents' death. "That won't be necessary, Alfred. You may retire," replied Jack with a wave of his hand. The butler gave a slight bow before leaving Jack alone with his thoughts and a plate of gourmet food he would barely touch as he picked at his dinner. Without appetite, Jack remembered the words his father had told him countless times. "Money doesn't buy happiness, son. The important things in life are the connections we make with others." At that moment, those words resonated more strongly than ever. He had everything money could buy, but he felt more alone than ever. Unable to finish his dinner, Jack abruptly stood up, grabbed the keys to his sports car, and left the mansion without saying a word. He needed fresh air. He needed to feel alive. The streets of New York City greeted him with their usual nighttime bustle. Jack drove aimlessly, letting the roar of the engine drown out his thoughts. It was then, at a red light, that something caught his attention. On the corner, illuminated by the dim light of a street lamp, he saw an older woman sitting on the ground. Next to her, a young woman who couldn't be more than 20 years old held a sign that said, "We need help, anything is welcome." Something about the scene moved Jack. Perhaps it was the dignity with which the older woman held her head high despite her situation, or maybe the look of determination in the young woman's eyes. Without thinking twice, Jack parked his car and approached them. "Good evening," he said, taking out his wallet. "I'd like to help you." The older woman looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and pride. "Thank you, young man, but we don't want charity. If you have any work we could do..." Jack was speechless for a moment. He wasn't used to someone rejecting his money. It was then that he had an idea. "Actually," he said, "I'm looking for someone who could help around my house. It's a big mansion and there's always work to be done. Would you be interested?" The young woman looked at the older woman, who seemed to be considering the offer. "My name is Sarah," the woman finally said, "and this is my daughter, Emily. Are you sure you want to offer us work without knowing us?" Jack smiled for the first time in what seemed like years. "Sometimes you have to trust your intuition," he replied. "I'm Jack Morgan. What do you say? Do you accept my offer?" After a moment of hesitation, Sarah nodded. "We accept, Mr. Morgan. Thank you for this opportunity." That night, as Jack drove them to his mansion, he couldn't imagine how this chance encounter would change his life forever. The following days were a whirlwind of activity in the Morgan mansion. Jack had designated the spacious basement as Sarah and Emily's new home and made sure it was furnished with all the necessary comforts. Sarah, despite her age, proved to be a tireless worker. She devoted herself to organizing and cleaning every corner of the huge house with an enthusiasm that surprised everyone, including Alfred, who had initially looked at the new residence with suspicion. Emily, for her part, was shy at first, but soon began to help in the kitchen, revealing a natural talent for gastronomy that left Jack amazed one afternoon. While Jack was working in his study, he heard a melody coming from the basement. Intrigued, He went down the stairs and found a scene that left him breathless. Sarah was sitting in front of an old easel she had found in the attic, painting with a concentration and skill that spoke of years of practice. "Sarah," said Jack, surprised, "I didn't know you painted." The woman startled, as if she had been caught doing something improper. "I'm sorry, Mr. Morgan, I found these old materials and couldn't resist. It had been years since I touched a brush." Jack approached to get a better look at the painting. It was an urban landscape of New York City, but there was something in the way Sarah captured the light and shadows that brought the canvas to life. "This is incredible," Jack murmured. "Where did you learn to paint like this?" Sarah lowered her gaze as if the memory was painful. "I studied at the National Academy of Fine Arts many years ago. I even had some exhibitions, but that was in another life." Jack felt he had touched on a sensitive topic, but his curiosity got the better of him. "What happened? Why did you stop painting?" Sarah was silent for a moment, her eyes lost in distant memories. "Life happened, Mr. Morgan. Life happened. Sometimes it takes us down paths we never imagined." Jack nodded, respecting Sarah's silence, but at that moment he made a decision. "Sarah, would you like to paint again? I could get you new materials, set up this space as a studio." Sarah's eyes lit up for an instant, but then doubt clouded her gaze. "I couldn't accept that, Mr. Morgan. You've already done too much for us." "Please, call me Jack," he insisted, "and don't see it as a gift. Consider it an investment. Your paintings could sell well, you know. I know several people in the art world who would be interested." Sarah seemed to consider the offer for a moment. Finally, a small smile appeared on her lips. "All right, Jack. I accept your offer. But with one condition." "Anything," replied Jack, excited. "I want you to paint with me," said Sarah. "I think you could use a little art in your life." Jack laughed, surprised by the proposal. "Sarah, I haven't touched a brush since elementary school." "It's never too late to learn," Sarah replied with a knowing smile. "Deal?" Jack extended his hand, sealing the agreement. Deal. That night, as he dined with Sarah and Emily for the first time since they arrived, a custom that would become habitual over time, Jack realized that something had changed in him. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of excitement, a sense of purpose that went beyond the numbers in his bank account. What he didn't know was that this was just the beginning. Fate had intertwined their lives in a way that none of them could imagine, and the secrets that Sarah kept in her heart were about to come to light, changing the course of their lives forever. Meanwhile, in a luxurious apartment in the city center, a middle-aged man observed the city with a cold and calculating gaze. Richard Baker, known in art circles as a successful gallery owner, hid a dark secret behind his facade of respectability. "Have you found anything?" he asked, without turning to the figure who had just entered the room. "Nothing concrete, sir," replied the man, a private investigator who had been searching for someone for months. "But there are rumors of a new emerging artist who's causing a stir in the underground circuit. They say her style is familiar." Richard visibly tensed. "Familiar in what sense?" "Like hers, sir. Like Sarah Thompson's." The name made Richard turn abruptly, his eyes shining with a mixture of anger and longing. "Find her," he ordered. "Whatever it costs, find her." As the investigator withdrew, Richard turned his gaze back to the city, his thoughts oscillating between the past he thought he had left behind and an uncertain future that threatened to unmask him. In the Morgan mansion, oblivious to the storm that was brewing, Jack, Sarah, and Emily began to form bonds that would soon be tested in ways none of them could imagine. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. The routine in the Morgan mansion had changed drastically since Sarah and Emily's arrival. The basement, once a forgotten space full of junk, had been transformed into a cozy art studio where Sarah spent most of her time, with Jack as her eager student. Jack discovered he had a natural talent for painting, something he never would have imagined under Sarah's patient tutelage. His clumsy strokes became confident and expressive lines. But beyond technique, Jack was learning something much more valuable: to see the world through different eyes. Art isn't just about reproducing what you see, Sarah explained as they worked together in the studio. It's about capturing the essence, the emotion behind what you're painting. Jack nodded, absorbing every word. It's like you're learning to see again, isn't it? Sarah smiled, pleased by her students. Understanding exactly. And when you learn to see like this, you realize there's beauty in the most unexpected places. Those words resonated deeply with Jack. He realized that for years he had been blind, focused solely on the numbers in his bank account and maintaining the empire his parents had built. Now, thanks to Sarah, he was rediscovering the world around him. Emily, for her part, had blossomed in the mansion's kitchen. Her culinary talent didn't go unnoticed by Jack, who soon found himself eagerly anticipating each meal. The young woman had a special ability to combine flavors in innovative ways, creating dishes that were as much a delight for the palate as for the eye one night. While dining on one of Emily's exquisite dishes, Jack couldn't contain his curiosity. "Emily, where did you learn to cook like this?" The young woman blushed at the compliment. "Actually, I learned on my own. When we lived on the street, I had to be creative with the little we had. I guess I developed an instinct for combining flavors." Sarah looked at her daughter with a mixture of pride and sadness. Emily has always been resilient. Even in the worst times, she found a way to make things a little better. Jack felt a pang of guilt as he thought about his own problems, which now seemed insignificant in comparison. "You two are truly inspiring," he said sincerely. "You've taught me more in these months than I learned in years of business schools." Sarah smiled warmly. "And you've given us a second chance, Jack. We can never thank you enough." "You have nothing to thank me for," Jack replied. "You've brought life to this house for the first time in years. I feel like I have a home, not just a mansion full of things." The moment was interrupted by Alfred, who entered the dining room with a concerned expression. "Excuse the interruption, Mr. Morgan, but you have an urgent call in your study. It's Mr. Baker." Jack frowned. Richard Baker was a well-known art dealer with whom he had dealt in the past, mainly related to the art collection his parents had left. It wasn't common for him to call, unless at this hour. "Excuse me," said Jack, rising from the table. "I won't be long." As Jack headed to his study, he didn't notice how Sarah tensed at hearing Baker's name, nor how her face paled slightly. In the study, Jack took the call. "Baker, what a surprise. To what do I owe the honor?" "Richard." Baker's voice sounded smooth and calculating on the other end of the line. "Jack, my dear friend, I'm sorry to bother you at this hour, but I have a proposal you won't be able to refuse." Jack listened with growing interest as Baker told him about an exclusive exhibition he was organizing, focused on emerging artists with unique and promising styles. "And this is where you come in, Jack," Baker continued. "I've heard rumors that you've been dabbling in art lately. I'd love to see your work and, who knows, maybe include it in the exhibition." Jack was speechless for a moment. He had never considered showing his work to the public. I don't know what to say, Richard. I'm just learning. I don't think my work is ready for an exhibition." "Nonsense," Baker replied in a tone that brooked no argument. "Let me be the judge of that. How about I stop by your mansion tomorrow? We can discuss it better in person." Before Jack could respond, Baker was already saying goodbye. "Perfect. See you tomorrow at 11. Good night, Jack." The call ended, leaving Jack with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. When he returned to the dining room, he found Sarah and Emily clearing the table. "Everything okay?" Sarah asked, trying to hide her concern. Jack nodded, still processing the conversation. "Yes, it was Richard Baker, an art dealer. He wants to see my paintings. In fact, he's coming tomorrow." Sarah dropped the plate she was holding, which shattered as it hit the floor. "I'm sorry," she mumbled, quickly bending down to pick up the pieces. "Don't worry," said Jack, approaching to help. He noticed that Sarah's hands were shaking slightly. "Are you okay? You look pale." Sarah forced a smile. "I'm fine, just a little tired. I think I'll go to bed early tonight." As Sarah hurriedly retreated, Jack couldn't help but feel that something wasn't right. He looked at Emily, seeking some explanation, but the young woman seemed as confused as he was. "Emily, do you know if your mother knows Richard Baker?" Emily shook her head. "Not that I know of. But there are many things about my mother's past that I don't know. She never talks much about it. That night, while everyone slept, Sarah snuck into the studio in the basement. With trembling hands, she began to cover her paintings, especially those that showed her most distinctive style. Silent tears ran down her cheeks as she worked. "I can't let him find me," she murmured to herself. "Not after everything we've been through." The next morning, Jack woke up early, nervous about Baker's visit. When he went down to the studio to prepare the paintings he wanted to show, he was surprised to find Sarah already there, with dark circles under her eyes that betrayed a sleepless night. "Sarah, what are you doing here so early?" Sarah startled at the sound of his voice. I wanted to make sure everything was perfect for your visit," she replied. Avoiding his gaze, Jack noticed that some of Sarah's paintings had been covered or moved. "Why did you cover your works? They're magnificent, I'm sure. Baker would love them." Sarah shook her head emphatically. "No, please, I'd prefer if he didn't see them. This is your moment, Jack. You should only show your work." Jack was about to insist when the doorbell rang. Baker had arrived. As Alfred guided Richard Baker to the studio, Sarah quickly excused herself, saying she had to help Emily in the kitchen. Jack watched her go with a mixture of confusion and concern. Richard Baker entered the studio with the confidence of someone accustomed to moving in the most exclusive circles of the art world. He was a middle-aged man, elegantly dressed with a sharp gaze that seemed to evaluate everything around him. "Jack, my dear friend," Baker greeted with feigned enthusiasm. "What a pleasure to see you again. I see you've been busy." As Baker examined Jack's paintings, his eyes constantly strayed to the covered works in a corner of the studio. "Interesting," he murmured. "Very interesting. You have talent, Jack. But tell me, what's under those sheets? More of your work?" Jack hesitated for a moment. "No, those are from a friend. She prefers to keep them private for now." Baker's eyes shone with an interest that went beyond mere artistic curiosity. "A friend? Well, you've always been modest, Jack. Are you sure I can't take a look?" Before Jack could respond, the studio door opened and Emily entered with a tray of coffee and pastries. "Excuse the interruption," she said with a shy smile. "I thought you might like some refreshments." Baker turned to Emily, and for a moment his mask of kindness slipped, revealing an expression of shock and recognition. He recovered quickly, but not before Jack noticed the change. "Thank you, dear," said Baker, his voice slightly tense. "You're very kind." Emily nodded and quickly left the studio, leaving Jack with a feeling of unease. Something was going on, and he was determined to find out what. It was Baker's visit continued for another hour, during which he praised Jack's work and offered him a place in his upcoming exhibition. However, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that Baker's real interest was in the covered paintings and, for some reason, in Emily. When he finally left, Jack hurried to find Sarah and Emily. He found them in the kitchen, talking in low voices with worried expressions. "Is someone going to tell me what's going on?" Jack asked, his voice mixing concern and frustration. "Sarah, do you know Richard Baker?" Sarah looked at Emily, then at Jack, and finally nodded with resignation. "Yes, I know him, and it's time I told you the truth, Jack. The whole truth." As Sarah prepared to reveal her past, the afternoon sun filtered through the kitchen windows, illuminating the faces of all three. At that moment, none of them could imagine how the revelations that were about to emerge would change their lives forever. The silence in the Morgan Mansion kitchen was so thick it could almost be cut. With a knife, Jack, Sarah, and Emily were sitting around the table, untouched cups of coffee in front of them. The tension in the air was palpable as Sarah prepared to reveal the truth she had kept hidden for so long. "Jack," Sarah began, her voice barely a whisper, "before I tell you everything, I need you to know that I never intended to deceive you. Everything I've done, I did to protect Emily and you." Jack frowned, confused. "Protect me? What are you talking about, Sarah?" Sarah took a deep breath before continuing. "Many years ago, I was a promising artist in New York. My career was taking off, and that's when I met Richard Baker." At the mention of the name, Emily visibly tensed. It was evident that this part of the story was new to her as well. Richard was charming and charismatic, Sarah continued. I fell madly in love with him at first. Everything was perfect. He helped me make connections in the art world, and soon my paintings were selling for prices I had never imagined. Sarah paused, her eyes clouded by memories, but there was a dark side to Richard that I didn't see until it was too late. It turned out that many of the connections he had made were actually part of an art forgery network. Richard was using my talent to create forgeries of famous works. Jack leaned forward, absorbed in the story, and, "What did you do when you found out?" "At first I refused to believe it," Sarah replied. "But when I finally confronted Richard, he showed his true nature. He threatened me, saying that if I exposed him, he would make sure I never painted again in my life." Tears began to run down Sarah's cheeks. Emily took her mother's hand, offering silent support. I was terrified, but I knew I had to do the right thing. I gathered all the evidence I could and went to the police, but I underestimated the extent of Richard's influence. Somehow he found out about my plans before I could present the evidence. Sarah closed her eyes as if the memory was too painful. That night, Richard came to my studio. He was furious, beyond reason. He beat me brutally. I thought I was going to die. Jack felt anger growing inside him. "That bastard," he muttered between his teeth. "But that wasn't the worst part," Sarah continued, her voice breaking. "Richard told me that if I ever painted again or tried to expose him, he would not only kill me, but also my daughter and my son." Jack froze, his eyes widening. "Your son? But I thought Emily was an only child." Sarah shook her head, tears falling freely now. "No, Jack, I have 2 children, Emily and you." The silence that followed was deafening. Jack stood up from his chair, staggering backward as if he had received a physical blow. "What? No, it can't be my parents. The Morgans were my best friends," Sarah explained, her voice barely audible. "When I became pregnant with you, I was terrified that Richard would harm you. The Morgans offered to adopt you, to give you a safe life away from Richard." Jack leaned against the wall, his mind spinning with this new information. His entire life, everything he believed he knew about himself, was crumbling before his eyes. "Why?" he finally managed to ask. "Why are you telling me this now?" Sarah stood up, cautiously approaching Jack. "Because Richard has found us, and I fear we're all in danger." Emily, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. "Mom, why did you never tell me about Jack? Why did you separate us?" Sarah sat back down, the weight of her secrets evident in the curve of her shoulders. "To protect you both, I thought that if I kept you separate, Richard could never harm you both. It was the hardest decision of my life. But, at the time, it seemed like the only way to keep you safe." Jack slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor, his head in his hands. "All these years did the Morgans know you were my biological mother?" Sarah nodded. "Yes, they knew. But they swore to keep the secret to protect you. They loved you as if you were their own son, Jack. Never doubt that." A sudden thought hit Jack. The plane crash. Was it really an accident? Sarah's silence was answer enough. "Oh God," Jack murmured, the realization hitting him hard. "Richard killed them, didn't he? He killed them because they knew the truth." Sarah nodded slowly. "I believe so. I could never prove it, but the timing, it was too convenient." Emily suddenly stood up, anger evident on her face. "How could you hide this from us, Mom? We had the right to know." "I know, honey," Sarah replied, her voice full of regret. "And I'm so sorry. Every day of my life I've carried the weight of this decision, but at the time it seemed like the only way to keep you safe." Jack finally stood up, his emotions oscillating between confusion, anger, and a strange sense of relief. I need time to process all of this." He headed for the door, but before leaving, he turned to Sarah and Emily. "Don't go anywhere. We have a lot more to talk about." As Jack left the kitchen, Sarah and Emily remained in silence, the weight of the revelations hanging over them like a dark cloud. In his study, Jack paced back and forth, his mind a whirlwind of emotions and thoughts. His entire life had been a lie, or at least not the whole truth. The parents he had mourned, whom he had idealized for years, were not his biological parents. And the woman he had welcomed into his home, who had taught him to see the world through art, was actually his mother. He stopped in front of one of his recent paintings, a work that captured the essence of the loneliness he had felt for so long. Now he understood where that talent came from, that need to express himself through art. It was Sarah's legacy, his true mother. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Emily. "Can I come in?" she asked timidly. Jack nodded. Unable to find the right words, Emily entered, closing the door behind her. She stood there, uncomfortable, as if she didn't know what to do with her hands or where to look. So she began, "We're siblings." Jack couldn't help but let out a bitter laugh. "It seems so—" "Look," said Emily, approaching him. "I know this is crazy. Believe me, I'm as shocked as you are. But don't you think it's a good thing? I mean, you've always said you felt lonely. Now you have a family." Jack looked at her, really looked at her for the first time since he learned the truth. He could see Sarah's features in her, and now that he thought about it, features they shared. How had he not noticed before? "You're right," he finally admitted. "It's just that all my life I've been Jack Morgan. I don't know who I am now." Emily took his hand, a gesture that before would have been casual but now was loaded with new meaning. "You are who you've always been, a good and generous man who gave us a home when we needed it most. That hasn't changed." Jack felt something loosen in his chest. Maybe Emily was right. Maybe this wasn't the end of something but the beginning. "Thank you," he said softly. "I think I needed to hear that." Meanwhile, in the kitchen, Sarah was battling her own demons. The weight of the secrets she had carried for so many years had finally lifted, but in its place remained the fear of what would come next. Would her children ever fully forgive her for separating them? And what would happen now that Richard knew where they were? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her phone. With trembling hands, she took it out of her pocket. The number on the screen made her blood run cold. "Hello, Sarah," said Richard Baker's soft and threatening voice. "It's been a long time." Sarah closed her eyes, trying to control the tremor in her voice. "What do you want, Richard?" "Oh, come on. Is that any way to greet an old friend?" Richard replied, his tone mocking. "You know exactly what I want, your paintings, Sarah. The originals, I know you have them." "I don't know what you're talking about," Sarah lied, though she knew it was useless. "Don't play games with me," Richard hissed, all pretense of kindness disappearing from his voice. "I saw the covered paintings in Jack's studio. I'd recognize your style anywhere. Those paintings are worth millions, and they belong to me." "They never belonged to you," Sarah replied, finding a strength she didn't know she had. "They were mine, my work, my passion. You just used them for your fraudulent schemes." Richard laughed, a cold sound without humor. "Oh, Sarah. You're still so naive. Do you really think you can escape from me? That you can protect your precious children?" Sarah's heart stopped. "Leave them out of this, Richard. This is between you and me." "It's too late for that," Richard replied. "You have 48 hours to hand over the paintings to me. If you don't, well, let's say it would be a shame if something happened to the successful businessman Jack Morgan or to the lovely Emily." Before Sarah could respond, Richard hung up. She stood staring at the phone, terror taking hold of her. She had believed they were safe, that they could finally be a family. But the past had caught up with them, and now she had to make an impossible decision. At that moment, Jack and Emily returned to the kitchen. Seeing the expression on Sarah's face, they immediately knew something was wrong. "Mom," Emily asked, the word still strange on her lips. "What's wrong?" Sarah looked at her children, love and fear mixing in her heart. "Richard called," she said simply. Jack visibly tensed. "What does he want?" Sarah took a deep breath. It was time to face the truth, the whole truth. "He wants my paintings, the originals, and if I don't give them to him, he'll come for you." The silence that followed was deafening. The three looked at each other, aware that they were on the edge of a precipice. What they decided to do next would change their lives forever. Jack was the first to break the silence. "No," he said firmly. We're not going to give in to his threats. It's time we face this together, as a family. Emily nodded, taking her mother's hand. Jack is right. No more secrets. No more running. We're stronger together. Sarah looked at her children, pride and love filling her heart. For the first time in years, she felt a spark of hope. You're right, she finally said. It's time to put an end to this, once and for all. As the three began to plan their next move, none of them could imagine the twists and turns that awaited them. The past and present were about to collide in a way that would change their lives forever. On the horizon, clouds darkened, foreshadowing the storm that was to come. But inside the Morgan mansion, a newly discovered family prepared to face whatever came together. The next morning dawned grey and rainy, as if the sky itself reflected the tension inside the Morgan mansion. Jack, Sarah, and Emily gathered in the studio, strong cups of coffee in hand, prepared to devise a plan that could free them from Richard Baker's clutches, once and for all. "Well," Jack began, his voice firm and determined, "we need to think about this strategically. Richard has power and influence, but we have something he desperately wants." Sarah nodded, her gaze fixed on the covered paintings in the corner of the studio. "My original works. They're proof of his fraud, but they're also incredibly valuable in their own right." "But why now?" Emily asked, frowning. "It's been years. Why is Richard so desperate to get them at this moment?" Jack rubbed his chin, thoughtful. "There must be something more. Something we're not seeing." At that moment, Alfred entered the studio holding the day's newspaper. "Excuse the interruption, but I think you should see this." Jack took the newspaper and read the headline aloud. "Major art auctions scheduled for next month. Never-before-seen masterpieces expected." Sarah's eyes widened. "Of course," she murmured. "Richard must be planning to auction off forgeries. Of my original works without the originals to compare, no one could prove they're fake. And with your reappearance in the art world," Jack added, connecting the dots, "the value of those forgeries would skyrocket." Emily stood up from her seat, pacing around the studio. "So what do? We can't just hand over the paintings." "No," Sarah said firmly. "Those paintings are my legacy, my life. I won't let Richard use them for his criminal schemes ever again." Jack nodded, an idea forming in his mind. "Maybe we don't have to. What if we use the paintings as bait? We could set a trap for Richard." "A trap?" Emily asked, intrigued. "What do you have in mind?" "Richard expects us to be scared, to act out of fear," Jack explained. "But what if instead we invite him to the mansion? We could organize a small private exhibition just for select buyers." Sarah frowned. "And expose ourselves like that? It would be very risky." "Exactly," Jack smiled. "Richard wouldn't expect us to do something like that. He'd be so eager to get the paintings that he'd let his guard down." "Meanwhile," he continued, "we could contact the authorities. Having evidence of his threats and his attempt to obtain the paintings would be enough to incriminate him." Emily nodded enthusiastically. "And I could help organize the event. No one would suspect the adopted daughter preparing a simple dinner." Sarah looked at her children with a mixture of pride and concern. "It's risky," she finally said, "but it could work. However, we'll need help." "I have some contacts in the police," Jack offered. "Trustworthy people who could help us without raising suspicions." "And I," Sarah added, "know someone from the past, someone who could be crucial to our plan." Jack and Emily looked at their mother curiously. "Who?" they asked in unison. Sarah took a deep breath before responding, "Your father, Jack. Your real father." The silence that followed this revelation was deafening. Jack froze, his mind struggling to process this new information. My father," he finally managed to say. "I thought he had died." Sarah shook her head, tears forming in her eyes. "No, he didn't die. But I had to push him away to protect you both. He was the only one who knew the whole truth about Richard's activities, and because of that, his life was in constant danger." Emily approached her brother, putting a hand on his shoulder in support. "What's his name?" she asked softly. "Matthew," Sarah replied. "Matthew Davis. He is a brilliant art restorer. He was the one who taught me many of the techniques I use in my paintings." Jack abruptly stood up, needing space to process this new revelation. He approached the window, observing the rain that fell incessantly outside. "All these years," he murmured, "I believed I was an orphan, and now it turns out I have a complete family." Sarah approached him, placing a trembling hand on his arm. "I'm so sorry, Jack. I know it's a lot to take in." Jack turned to her, his eyes bright with contained emotions. "Why didn't you tell me before? When you arrived here, when we started to get close, why did you keep the secret?" "I was afraid," Sarah admitted. "Afraid that Richard would find us, afraid of putting you in danger. But now I see that fear only kept us apart. No more secrets, I promise." Jack nodded slowly, processing her words. Then, to everyone's surprise, including his own, he hugged Sarah. "Thank you for telling me the truth," he whispered. Emily joined the hug, and for a moment, the three stood like that, a family reunited after years of separation and secrets. When they finally separated, Jack had regained his determination. "All right then, let's contact Matthew. If he knows Richard as well as you say, he'll be a key piece in our plan." Sarah nodded, taking out her phone with trembling hands. "I haven't spoken to him in years. I just hope he still uses this number." While Sarah made the call, Jack and Emily began to work on the details of the plan. Jack contacted his friends in the police, explaining the situation in general terms and requesting their discreet help. Emily, for her part, began to plan the event, thinking of every detail that would make the private exhibition seem genuine. After what seemed like an eternity, Sarah returned, her face a mixture of emotions. "I spoke with Matthew," she announced. "He'll be here tomorrow." Jack felt his heart racing. Tomorrow he would meet his real father. "Did you tell him about me?" he asked. Sarah nodded. "I told him everything. He's eager to meet you." As the family continued planning, they couldn't know that Richard Baker was also making his own plans. In his luxurious apartment, surrounded by artworks of dubious provenance, Richard was speaking on the phone in a somber voice. "Yes, I'm sure it's them," he was saying. "The woman is definitely Sarah, and the girl must be her daughter. But the man, there's something about him that seems familiar." The voice on the other end of the line said something that made Richard frown. "No, we can't wait. The auction is in a month and I need those paintings. If Sarah doesn't cooperate, we'll have to take more drastic measures." He hung up the phone and poured himself a glass of whiskey, observing the city through his panoramic window. "Soon, Sarah," he murmured. "Soon we'll finish what we started so many years ago." Back at the Morgan mansion, as the family finalized the details of their plan, they couldn't imagine the complications that were about to come. Matthew's arrival would not only add a new dynamic to their already complex family situation, but would also bring with it secrets from the past that would threaten to unravel everything they had planned. That night, as everyone prepared for bed, the mansion was filled with a mixture of anticipation and fear. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of a new phase in their lives, one that could lead them to freedom or ruin. Jack, lying in his bed, couldn't sleep. His mind was spinning with thoughts about the father he never knew, the mother he had just discovered, and the sister who had come into his life in the most unexpected way. What would Matthew be like? Would he look like him? Would he approve of the man he had become? In her room, Sarah also couldn't sleep. Memories of her life with Matthew, the happy moments before Richard entered their lives, mingled with fear for what the future might hold. Could her newly reunited family survive the storm that was brewing? Emily, for her part, stayed awake planning every detail of the event. Her determination to protect her newly discovered family drove her to think of every possible contingency. And so, as the night progressed and the rain continued to fall over New York City, the Morgan mansion prepared for a day that would change their lives forever. The past and present were about to collide, and only time would tell if love and truth would be enough to overcome the trials that awaited them. Morning arrived with a clarity that contrasted with the emotional storm raging inside the Morgan mansion. Jack woke up early, unable to sleep any longer due to anticipation and nervousness. Today he would meet his real father. As he got ready, his mind wouldn't stop racing. What would Matthew be like? Would they look alike? What would he say to him? So many unanswered questions, so many emotions bottled up for years. In the kitchen, he found Emily preparing breakfast. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and toast filled the air, creating a false sense of normalcy amidst the chaos of their lives. "Good morning," Emily greeted with a tense smile. "Did you manage to get any sleep?" Jack shook his head, gratefully accepting the cup of coffee his sister offered him. "Barely you." "Same," Emily replied. "It's strange, isn't it? Our whole life changing in a matter of days." Before Jack could respond, Sarah entered the kitchen. She looked pale and tired, as if she had aged years in now, a single night. "Good morning," she said softly. "Matthew, your father will be here in an hour." The silence that followed was heavy, loaded with unexpressed emotions and unasked questions. Finally, Jack spoke. "Mum." The words still felt strange on his lips. "What was he like, my father? I mean..." Sarah sat down, her eyes lost in distant memories. "Matthew is a brilliant and passionate man. When I met him, I was captivated not only by his artistic talent, but by his vision of the world. He saw beauty in everything, even in the simplest things." A sad smile appeared on her face as she continued. "He had a contagious laugh and an innate ability to make everyone around him feel special. But he was also stubborn and sometimes too idealistic for his own good." Jack listened attentively, trying to form an image of this man who was his father. "And why did you have to push him away?" Sarah's face darkened. "When we discovered what Richard was doing, Matthew wanted to confront him directly. I was afraid, not just for myself, but for you too. Richard had already shown what he was capable of." Her voice broke, and Emily approached to console her. Sarah took a deep breath before continuing. "I made Matthew promise that he would stay away, that he wouldn't try to contact us. I told him it was the only way to keep us all safe. It was the hardest decision of my life." The doorbell interrupted the conversation, startling everyone. Alfred appeared at the kitchen entrance. "Sir," he said, addressing Jack, "a man has arrived. He says his name is Matthew Davis." Jack's heart skipped a beat. This was the moment he slowly stood up, exchanging glances with Sarah and Emily. "Show him to the study, please," he said, surprised by the calmness in his own voice. As they headed to the study, Jack felt as if he was walking in slow motion. Each step brought him closer to an encounter that would change his life forever. Upon entering the study, he saw him. Matthew Davis was a tall man, with graying hair and deep eyes that reflected years of experiences and contained emotions. When their gazes met, it was as if time stopped. "Jack," said Matthew, his voice laden with emotion. "My son." Without thinking, Jack approached and hugged his father. All the questions, all the doubts vanished in that moment. For the first time in his life, he felt he had found a missing piece of himself. Sarah and Emily watched the scene with tears in their eyes. It was a moment of reunion, of healing, but also the beginning of a new stage full of challenges. When they finally separated, Matthew looked at Sarah. "Sarah," he said softly, "it's been so many years." Sarah nodded, unable to speak. Emily stepped forward, introducing herself. "I'm Emily," she said. "You're well. I guess I'm your daughter too." Matthew smiled, hugging Emily. "My family," he murmured, "finally together." The emotional moment was interrupted by Jack, who, despite the joy of the reunion, couldn't forget the reason they had called Matthew. "Dad," he said, the word still new on his lips. "We need your help. Richard Baker." Matthew's expression hardened at hearing that name. "Richard," he growled. "I should have guessed that bastard would be behind all this." They sat down and Jack proceeded to explain the situation and the plan they had devised. Matthew listened attentively, his face a mixture of pride at his son's astuteness and concern for the risks involved. "It's risky," he finally said, "but it could work. However, there's something you need to know about Richard, something that could complicate things." Everyone leaned forward, eager to hear. Matthew took a deep breath before continuing. "Richard doesn't work alone. He has connections at high levels, powerful people who protect him. That's why we could never catch him before. Jack frowned. How high are we talking? Politicians, judges, even some members of the police, Matthew replied. Richard has built a network of corruption that extends beyond the art world. This revelation fell like a bomb in the room. The plan they had devised suddenly seemed naive in the face of the magnitude of what they were facing. So, what do we do? Emily asked, her voice tinged with frustration and fear. Matthew stood up, walking towards the covered paintings in the corner of the studio. Carefully, he lifted one of the sheets, revealing one of Sarah's masterpieces. We use art, he said, his eyes shining with a mixture of cunning and determination, not just as bait but as a weapon. What do you mean? Sarah asked. Intrigued, Matthew smiled, a smile that Jack recognized as his own. Each of these paintings tells a story, and in those stories we can hide the truth about Richard and his accomplices, a truth that, once revealed, not even his connections will be able to protect him from. Jack felt a spark of hope ignite in his chest. An exhibition within the exhibition, he murmured. Exactly, Matthew nodded, but we'll need help, trustworthy people who can decipher the messages and act at the right moment. Sarah approached Matthew, her eyes shining with a determination she hadn't felt in years. I know some people, former colleagues from the art world, who would be willing to help. Emily, always practical, intervened. But how will we do all this in such a short time? Richard expects the paintings in less than 48 hours. Matthew looked at his newly reunited family, a proud smile on his face. We'll work together as a family. It's time for the art that Richard tried to steal and corrupt to be his downfall. As the family began to plan this new strategy, they couldn't know that Richard Baker was also making his own moves. In his office, surrounded by artworks of dubious provenance, Richard was speaking on the phone in a low voice. Yes, I'm sure, he was saying. Matthew Davis has reappeared. No, we can't wait. If he's involved, everything could fall apart. Prepare plan B and make sure no one can trace it back to us. He hung up the phone, his face a mask of cold determination. He approached a safe hidden behind a painting and took out an envelope. Inside was an old photo, yellowed by time. In it, 4 smiling figures could be seen. Sarah, Matthew, Richard himself, and a 4th person whose face had been burned out. I'm sorry, old friend, Richard murmured to the faceless figure, but some secrets must remain buried. Meanwhile, at the Morgan mansion, the family worked against the clock, not knowing they were about to unravel a mystery much bigger and more dangerous than they could ever have imagined. The countdown had begun, and everyone's fate hung by a thread. The following days at the Morgan mansion were a whirlwind of frantic activity. The family worked tirelessly, turning Matthew's plan into reality. Sarah spent hours in the studio, subtly modifying her paintings to incorporate the hidden messages that would expose Richard's network of corruption. Jack used his contacts in the business world to organize the exhibition and ensure that the right people would be present. Emily took care of the logistics, transforming the mansion into an improvised but elegant art gallery. Matthew, for his part, worked in the shadows, contacting old allies and preparing the ground for the big strike against Richard. His experience and knowledge of the art underworld proved invaluable. The night before the exhibition, the family gathered in the studio for a final review of the plan. Remember, Matthew said, his voice laden with tension, each painting tells a part of the story. The key guests will know what to look for, but we must make sure Richard doesn't suspect anything until it's too late. Sarah nodded, her eyes tired but determined. I've incorporated the details you gave me. Matthew, names, dates, places, it's all there, hidden in plain sight. Jack reviewed the guest list. We have confirmation from all the contacts you suggested, Dad. Journalists, art critics, even a couple of politicians who are willing to turn against Richard if they have the necessary evidence. And I've coordinated with the security team, Emily added. They know exactly what to do and when to act. Matthew looked at his family with a mixture of pride and concern. You've done an incredible job, but remember, Richard is dangerous and cunning. We can't underestimate him. As the family continued, finalizing details, they couldn't know that Richard Baker was also preparing for the exhibition. With his own plans that threatened to unravel everything they had worked for. In his luxurious penthouse, Richard adjusted his tie in front of the mirror, his face a mask of calm that hid the inner storm. His phone rang and he answered without taking his eyes off his reflection. "Is everything ready?" he asked. "Yes, sir," a voice replied. On the other end of the line, "The team is in position. At your signal, we'll proceed with Plan B." "Excellent," Richard said, a cold smile forming on his lips. "Remember, only if absolutely necessary, I'd prefer to resolve this civilly." He hung up the phone and took an envelope from his desk. Inside was an old photo, the same one he had looked at days ago. He observed it for a moment before tucking it into the inner pocket of his jacket. "Tonight," he murmured to himself, "everything ends." The night of the exhibition arrived, bringing with it an electric tension that seemed to charge the air. The Morgan mansion shone under strategically placed lights, transformed into a world-class art gallery. Guests began to arrive, a carefully selected mix of the elite of the art world, journalists, politicians, and influential figures. Jack, dressed in an elegant black suit, greeted the guests at the entrance. His charming smile hid the nervousness he felt inside. Every time the door opened, his heart skipped a beat, anticipating Richard's arrival. In the main hall, Sarah moved among the guests with a grace that belied years of practice. Dressed in a long burgundy dress, she stopped in front of each painting, offering explanations and subtly guiding the viewer's attention to the crucial details. Emily, elegant in a midnight blue pantsuit, supervised the catering and made sure everything ran smoothly. Her eyes constantly scanned the room, alert for any sign of trouble. Matthew kept a low profile, observing everything from a strategic corner. He wore a grey suit that made him look like just another guest, but his keen eyes missed no detail. Finally, the door opened and Richard Baker made his entrance. The murmur of conversations diminished for a moment as all eyes turned to him. Richard, impeccably dressed and with a confident smile, greeted Jack with a handshake. "Jack, my young friend," Richard said, his voice smooth as silk. "What an impressive exhibition you've organized. I'm eager to see the works of your protégé." Jack maintained his composure, returning the smile. "Richard, welcome please. Enjoy the exhibition. I'm sure you'll find the paintings revealing." As Richard made his way into the gallery, Jack exchanged a significant look with Emily. The game had begun. Richard moved through the room with the confidence of a predator, his gaze evaluating each painting with a critical eye. When he reached Sarah's first work, his expression subtly changed. Recognition, surprise, and then a spark of something darker crossed his face. Sarah approached, her heart beating hard but her voice steady. "Richard, what a... surprised to see you here." Richard turned to her, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sarah, darling, the years have been kind to you. I see you haven't lost your touch." "Some things improve with time," Sarah replied, holding his gaze. As the tension between Sarah and Richard grew, key guests began to notice the hidden details in the paintings. A journalist frowned at a date hidden in the landscape of a painting. An art critic muttered to himself, recognizing coded names in the strokes of a portrait. A politician paled upon seeing a scene that seemed to recreate a secret meeting he thought was forgotten. Matthew observed all this with satisfaction, knowing that the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together, but his relief was short-lived. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out completely, plunging the gallery into darkness. Cries of surprise and confusion filled the air. When the lights came back on seconds later, two things became clear. Richard Baker had disappeared, and the central painting of the exhibition, Sarah's masterpiece that contained the most damning evidence against the corruption network, was no longer in its place. Chaos broke out in the gallery. Jack and Emily ran towards the place where the painting had been, while Matthew quickly headed towards the exit. Suspecting that Richard would try to escape, Sarah, however, remained paralyzed in the middle of the room, her eyes fixed on the empty space where her work had been before. But it wasn't the loss of the painting that had left her in shock. In its place, pinned to the wall, was an old photograph. The same photograph that Richard had been looking at before. With trembling hands, Sarah took the photograph. In it, 4 figures smiled at the camera. Herself, younger. Matthew with a spark of happiness in his eyes. Richard without the hardness that now characterized his face, and a fourth person whose face had been burned out. But Sarah didn't need to see the face to know who it was. The memories she had kept buried for so long surged forth, threatening to drown her. "It can't be," she murmured, tears forming in her eyes. Jack returned to her side, panting, "Mom, Richard has escaped with the painting. We have to—" He stopped upon seeing the expression on Sarah's face. "What's wrong? What's that?" Sarah looked at her son, then at the photograph, and finally towards the door through which Matthew had gone in pursuit of Richard. "Jack," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "there's something you need to know. Something that changes everything." Meanwhile, on the streets of New York City, Matthew ran after Richard's figure, who moved with surprising agility for his age. The stolen painting was secured under his arm. "Richard!" Matthew shouted. "Stop! It's over!" Richard turned without stopping running. "It will never be over, Matthew, not until the truth comes out. The whole truth." They turned a corner and Richard stumbled, falling to the ground. The painting slid away from him. Matthew caught up, panting. "It's over, Richard," Matthew said, bending to pick up the painting. "You're going to pay for everything you've done." Richard laughed, a bitter and tired sound. "Oh, Matthew, always so noble, so blind. Do you really think you know the whole story?" Before Matthew could respond, the sound of sirens filled the air. Police lights illuminated the street. Richard looked at Matthew, a sad smile on his face. "Seems our time is up, old friend. But remember, the truth always comes to light, even the parts you'd prefer to keep in the dark." As the police approached, Matthew couldn't help but feel that despite having recovered the painting and being about to see Richard arrested, something bigger and more dangerous was about to be revealed. A secret that had remained buried for decades and that threatened to destroy everything they had built. Back at the mansion, Sarah was preparing to reveal a truth that would change the course of their lives forever. The night that had begun as a trap for Richard had turned into a Pandora's box of secrets and revelations. The fate of the Morgan Davis family hung by a thread, and the consequences of decisions made years ago were about to catch up with them all. The Morgan mansion, which hours earlier had been the scene of an elegant art exhibition, was now plunged into a tense silence. The guests had left, leaving behind a trail of half-empty champagne glasses and murmurs of astonishment at the events of the night. In the study, Jack, Emily, and Sarah were seated, waiting for Matthew's return. The stolen painting lay on the desk, recovered, but still laden with secrets. Sarah held the old photograph in her trembling hands, her gaze lost in memories she had kept buried for decades. The sound of the front door opening startled them. Matthew entered the study, his face a mixture of triumph and concern. "Richard is in custody," he announced. "The police are interrogating him now." A collective sigh of relief filled the room, but it was short-lived. The tension in the air was palpable, and everyone knew there were still truths to be revealed. Jack was the first to break the silence. "Mom," he said, his voice soft but firm, "you said there was something we needed to know. Something that changes everything." Sarah nodded slowly, her eyes meeting Matthew's. A silent communication passed between them, years of shared secrets reflected in their gazes. "It's time," Matthew said softly. 30 years have passed. It's time for the truth to come to light." Sarah took a deep breath and began her story. "It all started 3 decades ago when we were young and ambitious. Matthew, Richard, me, and Anthony." At the mention of that name, Sarah pointed to the figure with the burned-out face in the photograph. Anthony was the 4th member of our group, a brilliant artist like us, but with a vision that went beyond conventional art. It was he who had the idea to use our talent for something more lucrative. Matthew continued the story. "Anthony proposed that we create perfect replicas of famous works, not to sell them as forgeries, but to replace the originals in museums and private collections. It was a bold, dangerous plan, but at the time it seemed exciting. At first everything was going well," Sarah said. "Our replicas were perfect, indistinguishable from the originals. We became rich and famous in the art underworld. But then—" Her voice broke and Matthew took, her hand giving her strength to continue. Then we discovered that Anthony wasn't just replacing the works he was selling the originals to unscrupulous buyers, collectors willing to pay fortunes to own stolen masterpieces. Jack and Emily listened in shock, trying to process this revelation. When we confronted Anthony, Matthew continued, things got out of control. There was a fight, and in the midst of the confusion, "I killed him," Sarah interrupted, tears running down her cheeks. "It was an accident, but my hands were stained with his blood." The silence that followed was deafening. Jack and Emily looked at their parents, unable to reconcile this new information with the image they had of them. "Richard was there," Matthew added. "He helped us cover up what happened. But from that moment on, everything changed. The weight of what we had done tore us apart." "I discovered I was pregnant," Sarah said, looking at Jack. "With you. The fear that the truth would come out, that you might grow up under the shadow of what we had done. That's when we decided to separate. The Morgans," Matthew continued, "were close friends, unaware of all this. When we told them an edited version of the story, they offered to adopt Jack. We thought it was the best way to protect him." Jack stood up, unable to sit still. "But what about Richard? Why did he turn against you?" "Richard never got over what happened," Sarah explained. "Over time, his guilt turned into resentment. He began to blackmail us, threatening to reveal the truth if we didn't cooperate with his new forgery schemes." "But that's not all," Matthew added, his voice laden with regret. "A few years ago, we discovered something else. Something that Richard also knew and used as the ultimate card up his sleeve." Sarah looked at Emily, her eyes full of a love mixed with pain. "Emily, honey, Anthony was your biological father." Emily gasped, her eyes widening. "What? But how?" "Anthony and I had a brief relationship before everything got complicated," Sarah explained. "When I discovered I was pregnant, shortly after his death, I didn't know what to do. I decided to raise you as my daughter, without revealing the truth about your father." The silence that followed was heavy, laden with contained emotions and newly revealed truths. Jack and Emily looked at each other, united not by blood but by a shared history of secrets and sacrifices. Suddenly, the sound of sirens filled the air. Police lights illuminated the mansion's windows. Matthew peered out, his face pale. "It's the police, and Richard is with them." Moments later, the study door burst open. Richard entered, escorted by 2 police officers. His face showed a mixture of triumph and resignation. "Ah, the family reunited," he said, his voice laden with sarcasm. "How touching." The detective in charge stepped forward. "Mr. Morgan, Mrs. Davis, Mr. Davis, you're all under arrest for conspiracy, art fraud, and obstruction of justice in a homicide case." As the officers proceeded to read them their rights, Richard approached Sarah. "I'm sorry, darling," he said quietly, "but if I fall, we all fall. It's time for the truth to come out the whole truth." Jack and Emily watched helplessly as their parents were handcuffed. Everything they had fought for, everything they had built, seemed to be crumbling before their eyes. But then, amidst the chaos, Jack noticed something, a glint in Matthew's eyes, an almost imperceptible signal between him and Sarah. And he understood. This too was part of the plan. As they were led out of the mansion, Jack approached Emily and whispered, "Trust me, this isn't over." In the days that followed, New York City was shaken by a scandal that occupied the front pages of all newspapers. The truth about the art forgery network, corrupt politicians, and Anthony's murder came to light. But with each revelation, new questions arose. Public opinion was divided. Some saw Sarah, Matthew, and Richard as criminals who deserved to be punished. Others considered them victims of impossible circumstances, artists who had strayed from the path but who ultimately had tried to do the right thing. Meanwhile, Jack and Emily worked tirelessly behind the scenes, using the connections they had made during the exhibition, the hidden messages in the paintings, and the evidence Matthew had gathered over the years. They began to weave a network of support. The trial became a media circus, but with each testimony, each piece of evidence presented, the true story began to emerge. It wasn't a story of black and white, of good and evil, but a complex tapestry of grays, of difficult decisions and unforeseen consequences. Finally, after weeks of testimonies and deliberations, the verdict came. Sarah, Matthew, and Richard were found guilty of art fraud, but due to mitigating circumstances and their cooperation in dismantling the wider corruption network, they received reduced sentences. The judge, in his final statement, said, "This case reminds us that art, like life, is not simple. It reflects our highest aspirations and our deepest mistakes. The true masterpiece is how we choose to redeem those mistakes." Months later, in a small gallery on the outskirts of New York City, a new exhibition was inaugurated. Redemption, the Art of Truth was its title. Jack and Emily stood in front of the entrance, nervous but determined. The gallery was filled with works by Sarah, Matthew, and even some recovered pieces by Anthony. Each painting told a part of their story, a confession and a plea for forgiveness. Among the guests, familiar faces could be seen. Journalists who had covered the trial, politicians who had been exposed but now sought redemption, and figures from the art world who had been touched by this extraordinary story. And there, at the center of it all, were Sarah and Matthew, recently released, with electronic ankle bracelets but free at last. Their faces showed the weight of their experiences, but also a new light, the light of truth finally revealed, of secrets no longer kept. Richard was also present, away from the crowd. His role in exposing the full truth had earned him some leniency, though his path to redemption would be longer and lonelier. Jack approached the center of the gallery, Emily at his side. He took a glass and gently tapped it, drawing everyone's attention. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "This exhibition is not just about art, it's about truth. Painful as it may be, about facing our mistakes and learning from them, about family, in all its complicated and beautiful forms." He looked at Sarah and Matthew, then at Emily, and finally at the portrait of Anthony that presided over the gallery. "We are the result of the choices of those who came before us, but also of our own decisions. This is our story with all its shadows and lights, and we are here together to write the next chapter." As the night progressed, the gallery buzzed with conversations, laughter, and sometimes tears. It was a space of healing, of understanding, and perhaps most importantly, of hope. In a quiet corner, Sarah and Matthew watched Jack and Emily interact with the guests. Their children, who had grown up under the weight of secrets they didn't know, were now standing strong and united, facing the future with courage. "Do you think they'll ever forgive us completely?" Sarah asked quietly. Matthew took her hand, intertwining their fingers. "I think they already have, and maybe with time we'll learn to forgive ourselves." As the night came to an end and the last guests left, the family gathered in front of Anthony's portrait. It was a moment of closure, of acknowledging a past they couldn't change but from which they could learn. Jack looked around at this unconventional family, united by art, secrets, and finally, truth. "You know what?" he said with a smile. "I think this could be our masterpiece." And so, under the soft light of the gallery, surrounded by art that told their story, the Morgan Davis family prepared to paint a new canvas, one full of second chances, rediscovered love, and the promise of a future where truth, however difficult, would always find its place on the canvas of their lives.